you guys doing?
Good.
All right. Welcome. I'll probably be pulling this up several times throughout the time today. I want to start off by just sort of asking everybody, how many of you are in here are unemployed? Raise your hand if you're unemployed. You're not currently working at a job. Okay, a couple of you. How many of you are underemployed? Anybody need me to define that? Underemployed would be you have the capability to make a certain salary and work at a certain level professionally, but you are working under that. How many does that apply to? Okay, some of you raised your hand as being both unemployed and underemployed. I don't completely understand that, but okay. How many of you are misemployed? Want me to define that? You aren't necessarily being underpaid, nor are you necessarily working at a level beneath what you're capable of, but you're not working in the field that you really want to be or should be. Okay? Some of you raise your hand on almost every one of those, which again, I don't understand, but hey, it's your world and you're living in it. You can do whatever you want. Today I want to talk about, of course, my career story, your career story, and mine. Fortune, fame, or not, and the title is, of course, specifically chosen for specific reasons. And let me ask you this: is being unemployed, underemployed, or misemployed good or bad? Neutral. Why is it neutral? Not good or bad.
It's just where you are now. It could lead to better things.
Okay.
God could, have a plan for you while you are in your whatever station you're in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Good. Anybody want to add to that, buddy?
Yeah, I think, of course, when you're employed, that's good financially, but then when you're unemployed, there's a lot of skills and experiences that you gain during the time that you're helping.
Okay. Very good. I mean, these are healthy perspectives, right? What do we tend to think about being unemployed, underemployed, or misemployed? That it's bad, right? And certainly, if you need to make a certain amount of income and you're not making it, that's not good, right? But to the points you guys made, there can be some good things about it. So I remember when I was a little kid, there was this poem I read, and I've never forgotten it. And it goes like this: 2 men were flying in an airplane. That's good. No, that's bad. The engines stopped. That's bad. No, that's good. They had parachutes. Well, that's good. No, that's bad. The parachutes wouldn't open. Well, that's bad. No, that's good. They were over a large haystack. Well, that's good. No, that's bad. There's a pitchfork in the haystack. Well, that's bad. No, that's good. They missed the pitchfork. Well, that's good. No, that's bad. They missed the haystack. And that's where the poem ended, but I decided to add on one more line, and that is, they missed the haystack. That's bad. No, that's good. They lived and started a business that built better airplane engines. That just seems to have a better ring to it, a better ending to it, and I like the better endings. So today I'm going to talk about my story, and I'm doing that as a way to get at talking to you about your story. In telling you my story, I don't believe that my story is better than your story, more dramatic. I'm sure I'll share some things that you can relate to. I'm sure I'll share some things that are different from your story, but hopefully also a lot of things that you can relate to in your story, and we'll end, of course, more the second third. You can tell I am a math person. The second third. I guess that would actually work. The last third will talk about your story and some common principles, I think, that can be taken from my story. And I'm not telling you my story because I think it's any better or anything. It's just that it's my story. It's the only story I have to tell. So I figured that should be the one that I will tell. And so, having said that, go ahead, Alan. You know how in a lot of movies, the movie starts out and you see at the very beginning of the movie this very dramatic thing that actually happens towards the end of the story. And then what they do is they back up and they tell all of what kind of went on leading up to that, and then they capture that event again, and you see it in context, and then they sort of finish telling the story. Well, that's what I'm going to do here today. So that's what happened to me. Is in February, actually it started in November of 2008. And I had, and I'll tell you more detail about this, I had been laid off for the second time in an 18-month period. And I do a lot of career counseling, and there's a group that I had spoken to for many years called the Cobb Job Seekers. And there was a writer, Jennifer Reingold, who wrote for Fortune magazine. And she had reached out to the people who ran the Cobb Job Seekers, as well as several other groups all over the country. And this was a time, 2008, where the economy was really crashing. And so a lot of people were finding themselves unemployed. And so this person at the Cobb Job Seekers had gotten a call from her, and she reached out to a number of us who speak and just said, hey, got a call from the writer of Fortune magazine, and they're looking to interview some people who've got some interesting stories. Do you know anyone? Well, I had just gotten laid off myself. So I said, yeah, I just lost my own job. I'll be glad to talk to her. So she's like, okay, great. So I get on the phone, I talk with her. This is, again, like in November. And I talk with her, kind of tell her what all had gone on for me. And she said, okay, well, that's interesting. I don't know. The article will come out at the beginning of 2009 at some point. I don't know exactly when. And we will, I'm just going to let things go through the holidays, and I'll check back in with you after the beginning of the year. So I said, okay. Of course, I didn't really talk to anybody about it because this is kind of just this interesting novel thing that never goes anywhere. And so in January, right after the first of the year, I get a call back. And Jennifer says, so what's your situation? Are you still in job search mode? Well, I had already started interviewing at Georgia Tech, but I was still unemployed. So I said, yeah, I'm still in job search mode. And so she said, well, tell me a little bit more about your story. So I told her a little bit more about my story, and at the end of the conversation, she said, I think we are going to use your story. And I said, okay. So she said, I'm going to send a photographer down to your house this weekend. And so she did. So on a Sunday afternoon, my wife and I went home from church, and he spent about an hour and took about 200 to 300 pictures in an hour. One of those things where every move, So I was doing all the pose. No, I wasn't. And so he was from Czechoslovakia, whatever it now is called, the Czech Republic. And so he kept saying, you don't look sad. You need to look sad. You are looking too happy. Stop. Article needs to get compassion from peoples. And so we tried to look as sad as we could, although we weren't feeling sad, but we kept trying to look serious. And so then about a week later, I get an email from Jennifer that said, surprise, you might be on the cover. Because up until this point, we just thought, some little article will be in the midst of dozens of other people. And she said, I'm going to go ahead and FedEx you a copy of the magazine. So I hadn't seen anything. Right. And again, I'm thinking, okay, on the cover, again, there'll be a collage of dozens of people, and our little picture will be in there, which will be really novel and cool. So FedEx comes that day. Catherine, my wife, is upstairs in her sewing room, and she's on the phone with somebody. And I get it, and I look at it. And so I go upstairs, and I put it in front of her. She's in the middle of a conversation. She's like, oh, my gosh. So as you can see, it was cover to cover. Here we are on the cover of Fortune magazine. So I think a little bit later that day, John Durkota calls me, being John Durkota, and saying, what are you doing on the cover of Fortune magazine? And he said they ought to call it Misfortune. Don't you know Fortune magazine is reserved for the captains of industry? And so we realized pretty quickly we better call my parents, because we'd never said anything. They're going to get a copy of this, and they're going to think, oh my gosh, they're on the verge of suicide. Look at them. So, of course, they knew we were unemployed, so I called my dad, and I'm talking to him. I'm like, Dad, I just wanted you to know that actually Catherine and I are going to be on the cover of Fortune magazine. And he goes, oh, I'm so proud of you. Dad, all I did to get on the cover was lose my job. It's not like it was this big accomplishment, you know? So, you can go ahead and click, Alan. So, this was the article that was there. A career counselor takes his own advice. You can click again. And, of course, I just had to take this picture because it was a wild thing to have it hold it in your hands. It's a totally different experience to see it on the shelf next to these other magazines with all these famous people, right? George Foreman and Success Magazine, all that. Here we are. So I just had to get a picture. That was novel. Now, what bearing did this have on my career? Absolutely none. Absolutely none. Go ahead and go forward. So, welcome to me as a 3-year-old. So I'm going to start back. This is kind of like my summer vacation. I'm going to walk you through my entire life. So you guys do have like 4 or 5 hours, right? Don't worry, I'm not going to do that. So this is me at 3, and I was born, and don't go too fast here, raised in Denver, Colorado area. My dad worked for Adolph Coors Company, actually for 60-something years. Just retired about 2 months ago, which is unheard of nowadays, of course. But I grew up in a very blue-collar home, and my very first job I ever worked, this is not me, but was washing dishes at Luigi's restaurant. I got the job when I was 13, and I made 75 cents an hour. And honestly, this is not one of those stories that I made up, you know, to make my kids, yes, I walked uphill in the snow both ways, there and back from school with nothing to eat but a lettuce sandwich. Now, that's made up, of course. But it is true that my first job, I made 75 cents an hour doing dishes. I was paid under the table. I didn't know what that meant at the time. So they weren't paying any taxes. As a matter of fact, I ate more in pizza every night than I actually made in money. And they were actually very good to me. And it was good. I was able to save up money and buy a bike and some other things as well. And then, click one more if you would. This is my high school graduation picture, back when I had hair. It's hard to believe it's me, I know. Yeah, the 70s. So that's what I looked like. And again, I want to just sort of paint the picture given where we're going with all this. But for me, I was one of those people that you probably would have hated in high school because it seemed like everything I did just went golden, right? I mean, I went out for track and field. I ended up setting 11 high school track and field records at my high school. Tried out for the choir, got in the choir, tried out for a special music group, got in that. It was a madrigal singers group. Everything I did. I tried out for plays. I got lead roles in plays. Everything was just easy. I was a homecoming king, you know, in my high school. Feels weird, I have to tell you all this. And every now and then, when my wife especially wants to give me a dig, she'll say, "Hey, homecoming king," just to, you know, kind of drive it in a little bit there. And you can go ahead and go forward one more. One of the jobs I did for the summer was I installed swimming pools, which was great hard work. I mean, really back-breaking. This is not one of the pools we actually installed. This is just a picture I found on the internet. But I did that for 3 summers. Very, very back-breaking work, but it was how I earned money to put myself through college along with loans. Go ahead, one more. And then the very first sales job I ever had, I was selling books door to door in North Carolina. I lived in Colorado, and I sold books door to door out in these small towns around the Raleigh area of North Carolina, which was an incredible experience. I could spend a whole hour just telling you about what all went on there with all that. But it was after this time when I came back and I was decided to start studying the Bible. Now, in college, I had done a lot of theater in high school, so I'll never forget a friend of mine saying, "So what are you going to do with your life?" I'm a senior. I hadn't applied anywhere. Wasn't sure I was going to go to college. I said, "Well, I think I ought to be a plumber." Nothing wrong with being a plumber. I had no interest in being a plumber, but I thought that would be a good practical way, you know, to spend my life. She said, "Do you like plumbing?" I said, "No," but she said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I really love the theater. I would love to be a singer, dancer, actor." So she said, well, I think you have to try it. I think if you don't do this, you're always going to wonder what might have happened if you had. That made sense to me. I didn't know what else to do, so I thought, okay, what the heck? So I went to Colorado State University, that thriving theatrical mecca that it is, and I majored in speech and theater. And about 3 years in, I took a year off. And during that year, I traveled around the state of Colorado, actually doing professional children's theater in elementary schools around the state. And when I was back in the Denver area, I stocked the shelves at a store that was a liquor store and a drugstore. And that's what I did for a year. At the end of that year, I decided to go back to school, and when I did, the guy who had reached out to me before I took the year off reached out to me again, because during that year I was really stepping back and trying to figure out who am I and what is going on in my life. There were some personal things that had happened that really kind of set me reeling. Well, October 29th of 1982, I was baptized. So I'm coming up on my 31st year as a Christian here in October. And from that moment, I went from, or not right from that moment, but pretty quickly I went from, okay, I'm not going to be in theater anymore, because I already knew there was a lot of shows that I did in the past that I could never do as a Christian. And so I saw the people in the full-time ministry and thought, that's what I want to do with my life. So go ahead, Alan. So sure enough, after becoming a Christian, I went into the full-time ministry, and of course what I was so excited about that was having a chance to really study, preach, teach from the Word of God, to devote myself to prayer, right, as the Bible talks about, which I loved doing both of those, and then to do mission work. I remember the movie Gandhi had come out around that time, and when I saw that movie, it like shook my life. I thought, I want to go to India or some third world country and do missionary work. And of course, I was very fruitful as a Christian. And so, yep, I got tapped on the shoulder to go into the full-time ministry. And from then on, I had it made. I was in my dream job. I knew that I was doing what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. It was awesome. And I worked in the full-time ministry for a year and a half in Colorado. I was dating Catherine, my wife, at the time. We decided that where we needed to be was Boston, because they were sending out missionaries all over the world. So we packed up everything we had, and we moved to Beverly Hills, that is. No, and we moved to Boston. I'm sorry, I can't keep myself from doing things like that. Hopefully you'll forgive me for that kind of silly, stupid humor, but I can't control it. Oh, thank you, Camille. So we moved to Boston in the first year and a half that we were in Boston before we got married. I didn't work in the full-time ministry. I worked at a men's retail clothing store. And then I left there and got a job at a cemetery selling grave lots. The Boston Strangler was buried at the cemetery where I worked, which was not public knowledge, by the way. And I'm not even going to tell you the name of the cemetery. And that was because there were people in the Boston area who had family members that were killed by this gentleman, right? And they would go and deface the grave, so it wasn't public knowledge, but that was the case. Impertinent, but interesting. And then after being there for a year and a half, the church in Boston asked us to go into the full-time ministry, which was the whole reason we moved there. We were excited, so we went into the ministry, for me, the second time. Now my wife and I are married, and she's in the ministry with me. And this was, I believe, 1987, December of 1987. And again, this was awesome. I mean, we had all our time to do all the things that we love doing in working in the ministry. And it was a dream come true. We loved it. Some of our best friends were people that we were in the ministry with or that we converted. We saw our lives really making an eternal impact. And of course, the ministry is something you do for the rest of your life, so it was secure, and everything was great. And then we were asked to get out of the full-time ministry. What? And that was in 1994, after we were in the ministry for 6.5 years. And I felt like the light got blown out in my life. And so now it just so happened that a lot of other things were going on at this point, like we had 2 little kids under 4, and our third was about ready to be born, and my wife had a medical condition called placenta previa, which if it had happened 100 years earlier, she would have died in childbirth and the baby would have died, because there's a lot of complications with it all. Some of you women know exactly what I'm talking about, and those who you don't necessarily need to know. But it was very dangerous, and so she had to have an emergency C-section for my third daughter to be born. And along with that, it just so happened that while these 2 things were going on, my father had a heart attack. We had our youngest daughter, and she was in the neonatal intensive care unit at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. We get a phone call in the middle of the night while she's in the NICU. Of course, we were terrified to answer the phone, but it wasn't anything about my daughter. It was that my dad had just had a heart attack. Turns out that my wife's father also had a heart attack during that time. My mother was diagnosed with emphysema and COPD. And then we moved to a different area of the city, and I was wrestling with, God, why me? This was my dream, and now it's gone. What do we do now? I have no idea who I am and what I'm good at or what I want to do or what. Someone ran into and seriously damaged the van that we had. And we basically got to the point where we were getting benevolent help from the church because we had to be able to pay our rent, and we needed it. So much so that there was a single mom who had a really good job, and she was in our ministry, and she loved us, and 1 month she paid our rent for us. Talk about, us crying out of gratitude and humility, because it was incredibly humbling to let someone do that. Well, we also were going to the food pantry at the time because we needed to. And while we were at the food pantry, a woman approached my wife, said, I noticed that you have got some young girls. Listen, it was coming up on the holidays. She said, there's some families in the area that want to do something for you. Will you let us? So she's like, okay. So she asked my wife the types of things that my daughters might need or want. So she told her, and I'll never forget, on Christmas Eve, I went to a local fire station and, told them who I was, whatever, and they took us back to this back room. And there were, those like big 30-gallon trash bags? There were 5 of those filled with clothes, toys, and everything beyond what we ever could have given our girls. And we took those home. My daughters were in bed, and we unpacked stuff, and we just sat there in the living room, and we cried. I mean, I'm getting chills right now just thinking about it, right? Really, really challenging. I decided I was going to figure out what I needed to do with my life. And so I started reading What Color's Your Parachute and every other career book I could get my hands on. The church did pay for me to go to a career counselor, and I did 70 to 80 informational interviews. And finally I decided that really what I needed to do was to go into training and development. This was a long process. This took me about 4 or 5 months to figure all this out. And so next thing I knew, I was enrolled in graduate school, going back to get a master's degree in training and development. So that was great. In the meantime, I took a job that was 100% commission selling because it was the only job I could get. And by going back to school, it also meant that we were incurring a $45,000 debt that would have to be paid off. But we still believed that that was the right thing to do, and if we could just sort of begin to kind of claw our way out of the situation. And so this is kind of what happened. We'll kind of fast forward a little bit here. Just do one click at a time, Alan. So the very first job I got was selling home improvements for a company called Amri, which was short for American Remodeling. They're out of business now. But it was 100% commission. So I would get sales leads every day. I didn't know where I was going. I could have gone anywhere in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, and I wouldn't know till that morning where I was going. And so I would just get in my car, and even in the winter, in the deep snow, I would drive to their house and do all of what I needed to do to try to sell vinyl siding to these people. And it was great. And there were a couple of months, where I was a salesman of the month. But then there were a lot of months where I made very, very little money. And then in around Thanksgiving, I had like a sinus infection, and it wouldn't go away. So I got into the Christmas, and it was still there. So I went back to the doctor, and my doctor said, you don't have a sinus infection. You actually have mono. Well, that's not ever good, but if you're working a 100% commission sales job and you don't make anything if you don't work. In the meantime, my wife she had a paper route. So she was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and delivering papers in the morning. That's what she was doing. And so I was given all the antibiotics to try to get rid of the mono or whatever. And I still wasn't feeling better. I went back to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, Greg, you still have mono, and now you also have pneumonia. And so, wow, this is fun. So, again, not a good situation. I decided, okay, I've got to find a different job because I can't keep working a 100% commission sales job if I plan on being out for like a whole month because I'm sick. So I got another job working for a company called Sullivan & Cogliano. They did staffing, and they also had PC and IT training centers. So I was selling PC and IT training for them and started in graduate school. And shortly after starting there, I went and had a physical, and basically I wasn't ready to go forward just yet there, Al. Sorry, I shouldn't look over this. It's like being an auctioneer. You make a gesture and people do things and you call on them. That's all right. Just leave it for now. So anyway, I go to the doctor, and the doctor says, how long have you had that mole on your leg? I don't know, about a month or so. I think you need to have it removed. So I did, and it was melanoma. So it's like when it rains, it pours, right? It was like one thing after another. And so we're fighting through all this to think, God, what are you doing with all this? Do you just hate us or what? Right? And we're struggling and striving to pray and stay close to God. I can go ahead. So I finally, after 3.5 years, realized I wasn't going to go any further at Sullivan & Cogliano, so I got hired by a company based here in Atlanta called Ronstadt, staffing company. And they moved us down in 1999 from Boston to Atlanta, and I started off as a branch manager there, and then was on a 2-year rollout of a project to roll out a computer system across the country, and then ended up the last 4 years in training, which was what my master's degree was in. And so I ended up being at Ronstadt for 7 years. And I had a great career there, and they dramatically changed our financial situation. So that was awesome, right? And we were finally in a secure place. I worked there up until 2006, and I was being micromanaged to death by my boss at the time. Christy remembers this because she's heard me tell some things about that story as well. I realized if I'm going to keep my emotional health, I've got to get out of this situation. So I reached out through networking, what I call investigative marketing. Some people call informational interviewing, which I had done a lot of before. I found myself another job at a company here in town called Roosevelt Thomas. They do diversity management training and consulting. So I was hired by them to sell, and then as a consultant to facilitate their programs. And that was great, and it was great to be in the consulting world. I was making a little bit more money than I had made at Ronstadt, and that was going great. And again, I had initiated leaving Ronstadt. I'm in control of my career, right? And I was there, and I began to realize that the company wasn't doing so well. So the owner of the company, Roosevelt Thomas, came to us one day and just said, if we don't really dramatically pick up our sales in the next month, we may have to close the business. So, okay, so I started really going after my goals, And one day I come in on Mondays. We had a sales meeting every Monday. And so I was walking by my boss's desk, and it was like 2 o'clock when we had the meeting. And I said, hey, are we having the meeting? And he says, well, Greg, why don't you come in and close the door? So I came in, I closed the door, and he said, well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to let you go. Okay. I didn't see it coming. Even though I knew the company wasn't doing well, I hadn't done a lot to really start putting feelers out. Fortunately, I'd been in this boat before, and I knew what to do. So I started really doing the informational interviewing again. This time I decided to track my activity because I wanted to say, this seems like it's been pretty effective for me, so let me track and just see how effective it is. So I measured it, and I ended up being unemployed. This is 2007 when the economy was really tanking. And I was unemployed from the day I got let go to the day I started the next job was 10 weeks. And during that time, I ended up having 29 interviews at 18 companies and ended up with 3 job offers at the same time. So that was awesome. It was good. I just throw that out because I just happened to measure that, and that told me, okay, this is working for me. So go ahead, Alan. So I ended up at a company that was another training and consulting company based out of Boston called the Forum Corporation. And they did leadership training, sales training, and customer experience training and consulting. So I had heard of the Forum when we lived in Boston and when I first started to go back to graduate school, because these were like the primo training and consulting gurus in that space around leadership, sales, that kind of thing. So now I'm like, okay, this is awesome. And by the way, when I went from the job I'd had before at Roosevelt Thomas to working for the Forum, I got a bump in salary of $52,000. Which if you had told me that was going to happen, I would have told you that was impossible. But it happened. And so now, hey, I'm making by far more money than I had ever made before. Things are going great. Of course, yeah, we had a little tick in 2007, but I'm sure in 2008 the economy is going to come back up. Things are going to be going great. But no, that's not what happened, as you know. So in 2008, I was with my boss down in Orlando, and we were going back to the train together going back to the airport. And she said, Greg, we need to have a call with Allie, which was her boss, on Monday. And it's not going to be a call you're going to want to have. And so I knew that there was something up when, even though I was working here, I was on the email distribution list of everything that went on in the office in Boston, because that's where they were based. So, they would say, hey, there's donuts in the break room, one of those emails, you know what I'm talking about? I got those, even though I was in Atlanta. So I remember when the email came out saying, hey, guys, from now on, we're no longer going to be buying styrofoam cups, so you might want to bring your coffee mug from home. I'm thinking, oh, this doesn't sound so good. So sure enough, I got laid off again twice within an 18-month period, and this was just happened to be the day before my birthday in 2008. Once again, I found myself unemployed, and again, the economy wasn't too good. My boss, whom I had a great relationship with at the Forum, said, if I were you, you might look at higher ed. So I said, I'd been thinking that myself, as a matter of fact. So I decided to look into colleges. Well, it just so happened that I knew someone that I had used to work with at Ronstadt who knew someone who was now at Georgia Tech. So one thing led to another. And sure enough, it turned out that I knew 2 people who worked in executive ed in the College of Management, now called the Scheller School of Business at Georgia Tech. And so next thing I knew, I was working at Georgia Tech. Now, it was leading up to that this whole Fortune magazine thing came about, right? And I was careful in the article to not really say anything. I said I was interviewing at a local college, but I didn't know how Georgia Tech would feel about it, so I didn't say anything too specific. But yep, I got hired at Georgia Tech in the College of Management, and that was great for about 11 months. And then, it's kind of a long story, but The people who were running the department at that time were crazy. And so I basically had to either resign or be let go. So I chose to resign. And in the meantime, I reached out to the Dean of Professional Education, which just happened to be across the street. And sure enough, I got hired and moved across the street and worked for Georgia Tech Professional Education. I'm a nomad. And that was great. I learned a lot, worked with a lot of great people, was actually there for 3 years. And then about a year ago, about a year and a half ago, they started completely reorganizing professional education. And my job that I had gotten in professional education was actually created for me. There wasn't a job there, but they created the job for me and moved me into it. Well, as things continued in professional education, they began to realize, I don't really think there's a role here like this that fits. And so in March of this year, I was having a meeting with my boss, and sure enough, when I showed up to the meeting, HR was there. And so they told me that, Greg, I'm sorry, we're eliminating your position. Now, by this time, I'm starting to get kind of self-conscious. Actually, I'd become self-conscious a few jobs earlier. And I always made it a point to say and ask, okay, what could I have done better? And I grilled my boss here, saying, what could I have done better? And she really quickly said, Greg, this has nothing to do with your performance. We're just going in a different direction. There's no need for this role. Don't take it personally. It's not about, your performance in any way. And I said, oh, okay. And then I basically asked her again because I wasn't convinced, and she convinced me. And it's not to say that I didn't do some things that I maybe should have done some things in a lot of these situations that I didn't do. I'm certain that I wasn't perfect in all of this. But what I really believe through all of this is that God was in control and that there was a reason for it all. Go ahead. So, now what was really cool about leaving Georgia Tech was I was given 3 months of severance and an educational benefit, and 2 months after getting let go, I got hired again at Ronstadt, which I'm back there now, which is a whole new experience going back to somewhere where you had once been. But I'm walking in getting paid a lot more than when I was there before with a higher job title, and I love what I do, and I work for a great person. So it's awesome. Now, and I got that job in 2 months, so actually the 3 months of severance, I had an extra month of salary, which was cool. In every one of these situations, I first thought, why is this happening? And then when I got reemployed into the next situation, I always realized, you know what? If I hadn't been let go, I never would have come to this job. And if I hadn't had that job, last job or the one before that, I never would have been qualified to be in the job I'm in now. And that has happened consistently over and over and over again. So let me back a little bit further, and I'll give you, through all this, I'm trying to figure out who is Greg Dillon. So I Googled my name just to find. Even some animated characters. And that's me. So, according to that, I'm a strategist and a golf pro and a guitar teacher and an artist and everything else. So, in all of these things, I've tried to morph my career as I've gone through life. And I've been able to do that, even though I've always sort of kept within a somewhat narrow range of what I am good at, which I figured out back in 1994 when we first got out of the ministry. I now not only work at Ronstadt, I have my own business, which does career coaching and training. That's taken by my daughter, actually, for my website. And so that's who I am today. Now, there might be some more pictures next time I do this and some more job situations. Hopefully not. I think I'm at Ronstad for a long time. But some interesting things happened as a result of the whole Fortune magazine thing. I'll have you click through these one by one. Number one, when we appeared on Fortune magazine, I started getting calls from across the country, from people I didn't know from Adam. And it was pretty interesting. I mean, people would send, they would find, it was kind of scary too, because people could track you down. They found my email, they sent me messages, and they were, for the most part, they were incredibly encouraging. People saying, hey, I read the story, I really liked it, I just want you to know I'm praying for you. And we've been through similar things as what you shared about in the article. So I relate to you. I did get several calls from multi-level marketers because I have a training and a sales background, which if you're in multi-level marketing, that's like the holy grail, right? So I got a lot of those. I didn't take anybody up on any of those, but I did get those. I also, as I mentioned, got a lot of people voicing their moral and spiritual support. Some just incredible things, so much so, I even had people who wanted to interview me just because of the article in Fortune magazine. A couple different places they wanted, and I actually did go on some interviews. Nothing ended up being something I pursued, but it was interesting and it was flattering. I even had one guy locally here who anonymously, not anonymously because he had his signature on the check, mailed me a check for $50. Didn't know me at all. Saw the article, figured out my address, wrote a check for $50 and mailed it to me. Another woman actually asked my wife to do some window treatments for her because that's what she does. And she did that. And then one day I'm sitting at my desk and the phone rang. And I looked at my caller ID and it said Harpo Productions. And of course I'm like, Catherine, it's Oprah Winfrey. And I'm thinking, this is going to be awesome. We're going to go on the Oprah Winfrey show. My car's about to die. She's going to give us a new car. Because that's what she does. And so it wasn't Oprah Winfrey directly. It was one of her producers. And she said, look, we saw the article and we read your story and we're thinking about doing a show on the same topic. And so she interviewed me. We talked about it. She said, I'll get back with you tomorrow and let you know. So she called me back the next day, and they did not do a show on it. So I didn't get to go to Chicago, didn't get to be on Oprah Winfrey. So it didn't work out. But nonetheless, it was quite interesting, fascinating and fun. And then, finally, I got another call from a show that I had never heard of. It was called On the Money. It was on CNBC. It was a show about financial management, thus the name, On the Money. And so they wanted to interview me because of our financial situation. Go ahead and go to the next slide and then click on the video if you would, Alan. And I'll show you just a video clip. Whoops, you went one too far. From the show. Yeah. There you go. I'll get out of the way.
Now, Friday is a special day here at OTM. It's when we celebrate a money triumph and induct a new member into our Success Club. Tonight, we continue the celebration with Greg.
In November 2008, I lost my job for the second time in 18 months. I have one daughter in college and two others in high school. I've been paying out about $800 a month in Cobra health insurance. Needless to say, finding a job as quickly as possible has been a top priority. Now, I've also been a career counselor on the side for the last 15 years, and I knew that I needed to take my own advice and make a transition out of my old industry and into something more stable. When I was on the Money last time, the panel helped me by convincing me that making a move into education really was the right thing for me.
I want to help you get you back to work.
Hang a shingle in the area of being a person who can help train people through the economic challenges that corporations are facing.
Well, I'm very happy to say that I just recently got a great job offer from a major university in the area where I'm going to be selling their executive education programs to businesses.
Greg joins us on the Money Line right now. Greg, welcome to the Success Club, my friend. Yeah. Big applause for you.
Well, thank you very much.
Now, we've got Bob Rosner on the phone for you right now. Bob, Greg, hook up.
Hey.
Hey, Greg, you did it, man. Congratulations.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
The thing that I love about you that I think applies to a lot of people in the audience, you did something brilliant. You switched fields, but you switched fields from a position of strength because I like to consider you a twofer. You're a trainer and a salesperson. And everyone in the audience needs to realize that when you can bring 2 jobs for the price of 1, you're going to be in a lot stronger position.
All right. Thank you so much, Bob Rosner, for joining us again. Thank you, Greg, and congratulations. We'll be checking up on you. Please keep us posted. And if you're like Greg and you've lost a job, here's what you need to do right away.
She said that they would get back to me. She never did. I'm still waiting for Carmen to get back in touch with me. That's a joke. She's not going to get back in touch with me. I have no illusions about that. So, you know, all of this is interesting. And you might be thinking, well, sure, I could end up in a great place, too, if I was on the cover of Fortune magazine or on CNBC's On the Money. And again, I want to say, this stuff is very novel and very interesting. It had absolutely no bearing on my career whatsoever. It's an interesting story to tell. And one of the things I thought about even telling you to begin with is I remember when I was in high school and I wanted to be a professional actor, singer, dancer. And honestly, what was in my heart, I wanted to be famous. I wanted to be wealthy, right? That's what a lot of us want. And so maybe this was my fame, and my fortune was being on the cover of Fortune magazine instead of the money. But so I got what I prayed for, I guess, but it wasn't quite what I intended. You can go ahead, Alan. So, you know, that's my story. And again, I hope that it was interesting for you, and I hope more than anything that there's some things about it that, though were quite maybe different from your situation, there's probably also some things about it that are similar to some things that you've been through. Because this today is not just about my story. This is about your story and the common things that we all face as we try to get out there and navigate our way through the career world, right? So maybe like me, you've never encountered real fortune or real fame. But I do hope that, you know, like me, many times I've said, you know, I would have never chosen to go through all of that. Never would have been my plan. But having been through it, I wouldn't trade that for anything. Because there are so many things about all that that I think have been major ways that God has really convinced me about himself and his power and his ability to provide for me and my family. So the first thing that I want to sort of draw your attention to that I think applies to all of us is God's nonlinear pattern. And by that, what I mean is, you know, when we're in high school and sometimes even when we're in college, we just think, I'm going to get out of high school or I'm going to get out of college and I'm just going to make this straight beeline approach to success. And everything's just going to work out like dominoes falling and I'm going to pretty quickly be exactly where I want to be. Now, how many of you have had it work out that way for you? Anybody? Okay, Buddy has. And I think that's important because for some people, it does. It's not that it's impossible, right? You do hear about weird people like Buddy who have that kind of thing work out for them. I mean, so it's not that it's impossible. It's just that it's not often God's plan and pattern for our lives. And unless we're willing to accept that and let him put a different pattern to work in our lives, we're going to be fighting and resisting God's will in our lives. You know, if you think about it, if you're sailing in a boat and you need to get somewhere, but it just so happens that where you need to get to is upwind from where you are, you can still get there. But what do you have to do? You have to tack. It's called tacking. And you basically use the power of the wind that's blowing against you as force to propel you in a zigzagging manner towards the goal. And I have found that in my life, not only in my career, but in many things in my life, that's exactly what God is doing. He's letting the winds of life blow against me, and he's wanting me to harness that and zig and zag but keep focused on where I'm trying to get to, no matter how many turns I might need to take. If you think about, anybody have a Bible here with them? An NIV? Okay, Dustin, could you read Jeremiah 29? And you guys probably know this scripture, right? I'm reading it because we're reading through the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 29, have you read 11 through 14. And this was the same scripture that when Catherine, my wife, and I were announcing our wedding, and of course, Jessica, my daughter, and Sam, her fiance, announced their upcoming wedding just recently. But this was the scripture that we used back in 1987 to announce our upcoming wedding. 86, actually. So, go ahead.
For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope in a future. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity.
All right, very good. Thank you. Isn't that an awesome scripture? I mean, that is one of the richest scriptures in the Bible. Now, the thing about it is that it says, for I know, it's God talking, I know the plans I have for you. Silence, silence, silence. God knows, but you don't know. Right? That's the great rub of it all. He knows the plans he has, but you and I don't know what they are. What's interesting to me about that passage is what's going on when God says that. Do you know what's going on when God says that? The people are all being carted out of the country, and in the midst of that, God's saying, look, I have great plans for you. It's about hope and a future. And, you know, you're going to prosper. What? Why are you telling me this when we're getting taken in chains out of where we live? And God often does that. It's in the midst of your worst times that God's blessings are being played out in your life. I really believe that. So, the second thing, and Dustin, can you read another one for me? If you would, Jeremiah 27, since you're near there. Just read verse 6. And this is your holy teachers.
Now I will hand all your countries over to my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. I will make even the wild animals subject to him.
Wait a minute. Isn't Nebuchadnezzar the enemy? Isn't he the person who's responsible for bringing down the downfall of Israel right here? But God refers to him as his servant. So again, you and I have holy teachers. Who are they? They could be the boss that fires you. They could be the people that mistreat you at work. The people that torpedo your career in different ways. It doesn't matter what their agenda is, because God is your ultimate teacher, and he's a master teacher and trainer, and he uses all kinds of instruments to bring about his lessons, even though the instruments themselves rarely understand what they're being used to do. And that's what's gone on in my life. Again, I talk about the woman who micromanaged the living daylights out of me, and I left there to go to Roosevelt Thomas. Now, I learned a ton from her, though. A lot of the success I've gone on to have was because of things I learned from her. I hated it, but I learned, and it's helped me. Sometimes I think we tend to think only spiritually minded people can be used to teach us spiritual lessons. And nothing could be further from the truth. God can use whatever he wants. And in this case, he was using a completely pagan nation to teach Israel one of the biggest spiritual lessons they would ever learn. And he's going to continue to do that. And then I need one more scripture read, if someone else could. Dustin's exhausted back there. Could you read, you got an NIV also? Could you read Psalm 107, verses 1 through 6?
Through 6.
Yeah, please.
Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say this, those he redeemed from the hand of the foe, those he gathered from the lands, from the east and west, from north and south. Some wandered in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress.
You know, actually in the version I read, it uses the word story, tell your story. God has given Israel a great story to tell. And God has given me, what I'm doing here is just telling you my story today, hoping that it will encourage you about your own story and try to encourage you to get out and tell your own story as well. Because you have as dramatic of a story as I do. You've probably been through some things that were harder than the things I shared. Some of you haven't, but some of you have been through some things that were much harder. And you have seen God work in incredible ways in your life, right? Or you wouldn't be here. So I believe that God uses our careers almost more than anything else in our life to really accomplish His will in helping us to understand His working in our life. There's a word I just recently became aware of called VUCA. Anybody know what VUCA is? John Renshaw, do you know? John knows all, almost.
This is like the one thing.
Okay, the one thing. Good. Phew. I picked the one thing. VUCA is actually a word that was originated by the United States Military Special Forces. And it's actually an acronym. And it stands for volatility, keep going, uncertainty, complexity, one more, ambiguity. And you can imagine if you were in the Special Forces, really what this is all about. You know, volatility has to do with the nature, speed, and dynamics of change. Uncertainty has to do with the lack of predictability and prospects of surprise. Complexity has to do with confounding issues, chaos, and confusion. And ambiguity has to do with mixed meanings, the haziness of reality, and the potential for misreads. That's VUCA. And we live in a VUCA world, right? I mean, Jesus told us from the beginning we were living in a VUCA world. We didn't call it that. He didn't call it that. Probably to his disciples he did. But, so we don't read about it in the Bible. But this is absolutely the world that he described we were living in. We were being sent out, to John's sermon today, like sheep among wolves. Because we're being sent out into a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. Right? Success in our lives really depends on our ability to respond to a VUCA world. What I want is I want to have a life that can be transcendent of that world. I'm still going to be affected by it. I've got to deal with all of that. But I want my life to shine, right? I want to be seen as someone who isn't thrown off base because I get let go from a job. That I'm not wallowing in doubt because I don't see how I'm going to be able to pay some of my bills coming up. Right? And sometimes I think as Christians, we can be really spiritual in certain ways, and when it comes to our careers, the VUCA world throws us for a major loop, right? And so I think we need to respond to this VUCA world with a VUCA response. This is my corniness coming out again, I'm sorry. So instead of volatility, I think we need to respond with a vision from God. In other words, not just want what He wants, not just be involved in the activities He wants us to do. We need to do those things. But also I think we need to have a vision about our lives that God has. And it may very well be different from the vision we have had for our lives. Again, for me, when I was in a full-time ministry, all I could see, only thing in my vision for me was continuing on in the full-time ministry. And we got out of the full-time ministry. Now I was faced with, I've got to have a new vision from God about my life. When we got put out of the full-time ministry, I fasted for 40 days. I thought, I have got to figure out what am I going to do with my life, because I didn't have any plan B. I did end up coming to the belief that the best days were still ahead. At the end of that 40-day period, I came to the point where I thought, you know what? I don't know how, but I honestly believe that the best days are yet to come. And I believe that has been the case. Interestingly, we got asked to go back into the full-time ministry several times, and we always said no. So I believe that God's will has been, come out in our lives. Go ahead to the next one if you would, Alan. Another response, a VUCA response, is understanding of the world. One of the things that I see a lot, especially when it comes to careers, but in other ways too, is that in the church, I think we have a naivety about the world. We're protected from a lot of stuff, and I think because of that, we don't have an understanding, and we're surprised when the world acts a certain way. And we shouldn't be. That's how the world is. Again, Jesus warned his disciples, hey, I'm telling you, I'm sending you out like a sheep, and you're going to be among wolves. That doesn't paint a real rosy picture. And he said, look, I'm telling you, even people are going to kill you, and they're going to say it's in the name of God they're doing this. That's how twisted the world is. Understand that. Don't be shaken and surprised by that. So I think we need to grow, I think a lot of us, and me too, I've really striven over the last, is that the right word? Strived over the last several years to try to grow in my shrewdness and in my understanding of how the world works. Not so I can be worldly, but so that I can understand the enemy whose midst I'm living in. Go ahead to the next one. Then I think a big part of it is we need to have confidence, right? Confidence that God is going to take care of us. And I'm certainly not saying that even if you're confident, you don't worry sometimes. You don't be fearful sometimes because you can't see how it's going to work out. You interview for a great job and you're just convinced I've been here, God's going to end up saying no. He seems to like saying no to me. So, everybody ever felt that? I finally got a great interview with a great company. I really want it, so I'm sure it's not going to happen because God wants to just keep thumping me in the head for some reason. It's what it felt like. But you know what? He has continued to deliver me. And I have had incredible opportunities put into my lap. And I'm grateful for it. But he has never, ever failed to provide. Whether it was through a single mom who paid our rent, a boss who did me a favor and let me go, or what? God has always delivered us from whatever situations we were in. And then finally, what I want for you is an agility in your career. That ability to strike a balance, to not be thrown off, to be able to make some jogs and take some different directions in your career, and to do it adeptly and smoothly and gracefully, and not get thrown off by having to make some career moves. Because they're likely to happen to us all. As a matter of fact, they say that right now for anybody getting out of college, the average person getting out of college now is going to have 14 different jobs by the time they're 38. If you're not agile with your career, that's going to wig you out. And it doesn't stop when you hit 38 either, right? A lot of us are a bit older than that now, and we're finding ourselves faced with some very interesting situations at this season in our life. And so again, it just requires some agility on our part. I show this because, to me, one of the most interesting precious stones there is a pearl. And what's interesting about it is that basically a pearl is a product of pain and irritation. What happens is you have a clam, and it gets a grain of sand that comes enters into the clamshell, and it irritates the clam. So what the clam does is it secretes a fluid that covers that grain of sand. And that, I guess, makes it feel a little bit better. But it doesn't go away because it's still in there and it's still creating some irritation. So the clam continues to secrete this same fluid building up a pearl in the shell of the clam, which is an incredible thing. Now, if you open your Bibles, and you don't have to, I'm just going to refer it to you, you can write it down, to Matthew 13, verse 44, it says, "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field." Now, I love this parable, right? Because it's about us finding the kingdom, right? So, in this parable, what is the kingdom? The treasure, right? So we are the people, and we're going through the field, and we stumble upon the kingdom, the treasure, and magic happens. And a lot of times I think we go ahead to read the next verse, verse 45, and we think that Jesus is redundant here. We think he's going to basically say the same thing, because it says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it." Is Jesus saying the same thing he did in verse 44? What is the kingdom in this verse? It's the person doing the looking. It's not the pearl. It's the merchant. Not only are you and I seeking for God, he's seeking for us. What's he looking for? He's looking for a pearl who's created as the product of pain. It's no accident that the pearly gates of heaven are made out of pearl, the product of pain. God has built into our existence and our making it to heaven this whole pattern of the zigzagging and the pain that goes with it and the uncertainty, so that we will end up precious stones that were created out of his process. So, to me, I get chills. I think about it. This isn't my life, and all the stuff that's gone on with it has not been a grand mistake or a series of mistakes, and neither has yours. It's been all a part of God's master plan, and he's using your career like a master trainer, subjecting you to uncertainty, volatility, confusion, chaos, disappointment. And fortunately, he mixes in there a bunch of good stuff too. But when we start off our lives a lot of times in the sense of our career, we have this view of life is going to be nothing but sunshine, right? Constant sunshine is a recipe for a desert. God doesn't want us to have a desert of a life. He wants us to have a lush, vibrant, thriving life. So he makes it rain on us. Have you been feeling the rain? So to close out here, and then we can open it up for comments and questions. You have a story. And what I want you to do is to learn your story. And I say that because you may be thinking, well, what do you mean, learn my story? It's my story. Yeah, but a lot of us haven't taken the time to really step back and really learn our story. We've lived it, but we don't see it. It's like the forest. We can't see the forest because of the trees. I want you to step back and learn your story, what it is that God has done and what he's showing you. The second thing is I want you to embrace it, right? Embrace your story. You may be thinking, well, yeah, but again, I wasn't on the cover of Fortune. I wasn't in da-da-da. I've only made this amount of money, or I got fired because of, bad performance or what. Well, so what? Welcome to the human race. We all have, right? Stop wanting someone else's story. Embrace your own story, warts and all. It's your story. It's the only story you have. And then once you embrace it, what you need to then do is promote it. Tell your story. Your story has magical powers to change other people's lives. In many ways, when we reach out to people from an evangelistic perspective, the real power is in our story. It's the Bible, but it's the Word of God living in our story. That was what got my attention. I could read something on here, but it was all theoretical until I saw it in the lives of people and I heard their stories. Then it was powerful. It came to life. So, that's my story, and I'm eager to hear how it finishes out because my story's not done yet. But that's also, hopefully, you see some things in this that are a part of your story, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out as well. Thanks for coming. I hope it's been helpful. Again, I want to open it up to comments or questions or whatever.